So let's get started. I'm Jack Snyder. I'm the acting director of the Harriman Institute, but you don't need to remember my name because Valentina will be back very soon next year with a lot of research that she will have completed. So the director's seminar is, a tradition that, goes back in time at the Harriman. And it's generally speaking a venue for postdocs at the Institute to present their research, new faculty, and random other people. Tim Fry has just volunteered. And, so in due course, you will hear him at a director's seminar. Today, we're hearing from Anastasiia Vlasenko, who is like the envy of all of us because she has had postdocs at like all the best places. Here she's the Petro Jacyk postdoc in Ukrainian studies. And recently she has been fellow at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and at the NYU Jordan Center. And because of all of this time off and support, she is well along on her monograph project on legislators in networks, corruption, clientelism, and lawmaking. Her PhD is from Florida State in 2022, and she's taught at the Kiev School of Economics. So please tell us about your work.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. So yes, today I am not going to talk about legislative corruption. We really hope with Matthew to organize a separate event on that so that we can invite you all. But instead, I will talk about the relationship between protest and pro-democratic reforms. And yes, we're going to talk about Ukraine. And yes, we're going to talk about the most known protest in the Ukrainian history, and that is Euromaidan. So without any further ado, let's go back to November 2013. So, as you probably remember, this is a time when Viktor Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine at that time, refused to sign the association agreement. And that resulted in what you see on this video. Massive crowds of people first came to Euromaidan, for a much smaller protest than this one, but then when the police confronted in a very violent way the protesters, their parents and relatives showed up the next day, and some people estimated that at this point, late November, there were about 1 million people on Euromaidan in Kyiv. Well, we might argue that maybe not 1 million, but still, it was a very massive protest. And similar protests were happening all over Ukraine. Now, what I want you to notice about this video is that there are a lot of political flags here. Political parties were badly represented there, and moreover, people on the streets were actually against any political representation. Instead, you can see lots of flags that are just Ukrainian flags, lots of flags of the EU. And the main message here was not who comes to power next, but who is going to sign this association agreement that was not signed. So that was the main objective. And when the revolution won in February 2014, that was the first thing on the agenda. We are going in the direction of the EU, we are looking for this association, but after signing the association, we have to become members of the EU. And so these three glorious guys come to power, and this is the primary thing that they have to do. So in the middle, you see Petro Poroshenko, who became the president of Ukraine after Euromaidan. This is Arseniy Yatsenyuk, Prime Minister #1. This is Volodymyr Groysman, Prime Minister #2. So together, these people worked a lot in order to implement a number of reforms that basically are currently considered to be pro-democratic reforms, post-Euromaidan reforms and reforms that were designed to make Ukraine closer to the EU. And this is a moment where we have to talk about something that is called the Copenhagen criteria. So if you actually drank kvass today, you might have noticed that the cap is attached to the bottle. You cannot take it off. And this is actually in compliance with the Copenhagen criteria. Okay, so basically what is happening with this cap is that in the EU, you're supposed to keep it attached to the bottle so that it is recycled altogether. And as Ukraine is trying to go in that direction, everything that is produced in Ukraine is supposed to comply with the EU standards, including kvass. So this criteria is typically divided into three subsections. The first one is political. You have to have functioning democratic institutions, very simple. Then economic, first of all, you have to have market economy, but also you have to be competitive at the EU market if you are to join the EU market. And finally, there is legislative component, and this is basically saying that all legislation that exists in the country has to be in compliance with the whole body of the EU law, and that is a lot. So, what was happening in spring 2014 is that they were going through all Ukrainian legislation, trying to make sure that we're integrating minorities, something that people didn't really think through, especially non-Russian minorities, right? Then that we are caring about, how agriculture works in Ukraine, how business support works in Ukraine. And one of the most important components of this process, something that the European Commission cared most about, was the decentralization reform. So if you look at this criteria, decentralization reform fits all of them. First of all, it is a common belief in the European Union and in political science in general, that if you have decentralized governance in your country, you're going to have more stable, much stronger democratic institutions, because we believe that, this local knowledge produces better outcomes for democratic participation and for, distribution of public goods. So, in addition, it fits economic criteria because in decentralized communities, there is better support for local businesses, there is better exchange of goods and services. So we need decentralization for that. In addition, this is in compliance of the EU law. So all EU member states at some point underwent a very similar decentralization reform. It might have happened before the EU accession, it might have happened after, as for some Baltic states, but generally speaking, you have to be decentralized. So what does it even mean to be decentralized? Well, in the Ukrainian case, the government that came right after the Euromaidan basically immediately made a decision that we are decentralized. And in 2014, they had all legislation in place. And the reform was scheduled to start in 2015, so a year after. And the reason why it took 5 years for Ukraine to decentralize is because at the beginning, it was on the voluntary basis. What does it mean? How can you reform on the voluntary basis? Each local community was supposed to make a decision for themselves whether they want to decentralize or not. But they had a deadline, and the deadline was October 25th, 2020. The reason for that is because on this day, Ukraine had local elections, and before the next round of local elections, the government wanted the whole country to vote as decentralized communities. So within this 5-year period, here's what happened. Every community would make a decision that they're going to decentralize. They will send documents to central authorities. Central authorities authorize decentralization. They will have then they will have public hearings locally. People will express their opinions on that. And then it will go back and forth until they decentralize and final decision is made by the local council. And honestly, people had concerns about this whole EU thing. It's import of democracy at this point, right? Because what does it mean? Maybe we will get some local subnational autocrats as a result of this decentralization. That's possible. That's actually what happened in China when they tried to decentralize, right? Then maybe local authorities will take it as a chance to be even more corrupt than they are. Maybe there will some misallocation of, locally collected taxes. Who knows? So they were not particularly eager, residents, I mean, about the whole thing. However, the EU made a lot of effort to promote the idea. So basically, they ran a campaign, the European Commission funded a campaign within the EU-LEAD project in Ukraine. And basically, the idea was that, hey, guys, we have administrative reform and we have fiscal reform. Administrative reform, local councils, together with local mayors, will have enormous decision-making power that they didn't have before. And we will break up with this highly hierarchical Soviet system of decision-making. You don't need approvals for everything from the central authorities anymore. You are free, basically. In addition, we will make our Hromadas larger. So in the past, many local communities were not really doing well in terms of budget spending, but also budgetary revenue, because they were way too small. So, you know, if your annual budget is smaller than the cost of a bus stop, you cannot build this bus stop. So this is why a lot of local communities were failing financially. So now communities will be larger, we will amalgamate several communities together, and they will be stronger. And then you are to keep your locally collected taxes, which is huge if you think about it. You will keep 60% of income tax, 100% of property tax, 100% of the single tax, and like the list goes on, but the idea is that you have money. And as a local community, you can control your money through the activities of your local council, obviously, but also we will implement a number of ways for residents to still directly involved. For example, budgetary revenue oversight from local residents, participatory budgets for local residents, so on and so forth. So you will be able to participate. So this is the essence of the reform that happened. And eventually in 2020, everybody who failed to decentralize by 2020 was forcefully decentralized by the government, the central government. So right now, everybody is decentralized. So this variation in timing actually allows me to look at the time when the reform was adopted and to question what affected this delay or vice versa speed up of the reform implementation. So on this map, you see all territorial communities of Ukraine minus Crimea minus eastern regions, because in 2014 they were already invaded. And everything that is light blue here are the communities that decided not to decentralize in the first 2 years. And everything that is dark blue are the ones that decentralized in 2015, 2016. Obviously, I have dates in my data set, so I know for every one of them, like up to a date. But, you know, this is just to give you an example of what was going on. You know, as you can see, geographic spread is, you know, quite even, more or less. You know, we have some clusters, but really, I cannot build any hypothesis here. And generally speaking, while it was not 60-60 in 2016, eventually, you know, this map got bluer and bluer until the whole country was decentralized. So that leads me to a couple of questions. My first question is whether protests can affect the adoption of institutional reform in a newly formed, you know, quite young democracy like Ukraine, with democratic institutions that, you know, they are there, but they are not particularly strong. And in addition, I'm asking two specific questions. First of all, whether mass mobilization like Euromaidan can speed up or delay the reform. And second, whether this, you know, protest experience has any effect whetsoever on the efficiency of reform implementation. Whether this reform is a good reform with some sort of tangible policy outcomes, or whether it's one of those straw man, you know, reforms that never have any real effects on people's lives. So, surprise, surprise, reform and protest are two widely studied phenomena, and a relationship between them is also widely studied. But if we look into the readings, we will see a very interesting pattern. First of all, there are studies that argue that yes, pro-democratic protest leads to pro-democratic reform. Like, you can make up your own mechanisms here, but it's kind of logical and intuitive. But then we have studies that say that protest can hinder reforms. And basically the idea here is that protest radicalizes people. And they become afraid of any reforms or anything wrong going on because they don't want to be associated with that radicalization. So instead of actually promoting reforms, protests, have this negative impact by scaring people away from, pro-democratic changes. And there is a body of literature that says, well, these two things are not related at all. We have reforms that are like part of public policy / governance, and then we have protests, which is like all about mobilization, political behavior. These two things are not related. So I am trying to argue that the relationship between these two things requires a little bit more attention. So I'm saying that, yes, actually, it looks like under certain conditions, protests can be associated with reform delay. It will just take longer for the reform to be implemented. And I'm saying that this is happening because protests gives those who are protesting a sense that they can voice their concerns. And if a lot of people actively participate in any discussion. Let's imagine we wanted, in addition to vareniki, we wanted some pizza, and we were all discussing pizza flavors, and everybody would be voicing their choices. Well, that we would eventually order some pizza, but it would take us a while to decide on flavors, right? So the idea is the same. If we want, when we have this grassroots decision-making process after the pro-democratic protest, well, it will take us a while to discuss our options. But then, on the other hand, I'm arguing that once we implemented this reform, our knowledge acquired through protests, through mass mobilization, will actually allow us to stay active politically and to be actually using the benefits of pro-democratic reform to our advantage, to actually be using, the resources that become available to us. And that basically, implies that reform implementation will be more effective. So that leads me to two hypotheses. First of all, that protest is probably associated with reform delay. And the second one is that protest appears to correlate with, increased gains from reform implementation. So let's have a look at how I'm trying to test that. So basically, what I'm doing here is that I am measuring reform delay in days. And basically what I'm doing is that I'm looking at how many days from the end of the protest it took every local community to implement the reform. So there was difference in days between all of them. How much? This is my measure for the dependent variable. For the independent variable, I'm just playing with different measures for a protest. So my protest is Euromaidan, right? So I'm looking whether there was a protest or no protest, maybe. And then I'm kind of trying to play with different measures of its intensity. So unlike in Kiev, where people just came to Euromaidan, put up their tents and just sat there for 3 months, that was not the reality for the majority of communities. What was happening was that people would come, protest, and then go home. Then they would come back, protest, and then go home. So the number of protest events within Euromaidan was very different because, once you go home, it's really difficult to go outside again, especially when, you encounter freezing temperatures and also threat from police violence, right? So it's difficult. But also, in some localities, people would come to the protest event, and then they would stay several days, then they would come home, and then they would come again, and they would stay for even more days, and they would come home. So I'm trying to look at the average number of days per protest event, and also at the number of protest events within this 3 months period. And then finally, I have a bunch of controls. And basically what I'm trying to do here is I'm controlling for the size and population of each territorial community. But also, as you probably remember, Russian invasion started in 2014. It's like only full scale started in 2020. So I'm also measuring the distance to the Russian/Belarus border, just assuming that, maybe people who are under existential threat are less likely in decentralization reform changes. And finally, I'm looking at the percentage of urban population. And I will tell you right away, Cities are different than villages, so you will see like crazy statistical significance there. And I'm currently thinking maybe I should drop villages or drop cities. I don't know. I'm looking forward to your feedback, before I send it out for publication. So for my Euromaidan data set, I am using the data set that I collected with my co-author years ago for another publication in JOP. But the idea there was that we had two different measures. The one was based on mass media reports with pictures. So we know for a fact that, protest events happened, but then we had this other measure where we were trying to predict whether protests happened or not based on like Twitter activity, what people posted. So here I decided to be as conservative as possible. So these are basically events that happened for sure. They are predicted both through the Twitter algorithm and I have mass media reforms and I have the reports and I have pictures. Yes.
Sorry, just a quick question. That far left part of Ukraine, is it more densely populated or were there actually more protests per capita?
I'm getting there. So Euromaidan was like this pro-Western movement, and Western regions of Ukraine that is back before, Sluha Narod and Zelensky kind of colored the whole electoral map into green color. That's before that. So Western regions were much more likely to have Euromaidan protests, and Eastern regions were less likely to have Euromaidan protests. And I'm kind of trying to tackle this by this distance to the Russian border. But basically, yes, we have more intensity in Western regions. Fun fact, unrelated honestly to this, before the full-scale invasion and before even 2014 invasion, Eastern regions were more populated than Western regions because of the history of mining in those regions. So, just a fun fact, but it's unrelated to this. All right, so yes, Euromaidan was a pro-EU movement, so whoever is closer to the EU was more supportive. And yes, we do lack a nice even geographic spread there. I am fully aware. Also, these are protest events, people self-selected to protesting. So that's another thing. All right. So I tried to look at basically like a very basic type of, covariation here. So on the x-axis, we have the number of protests per Hromada, per territorial community. On the y-axis, we have reform delay in days. And you can see that, it varies from 500 to like more than 2000. So, pretty good delay. And then for the colors, we have lamps on, but the lighter the color, the more territorial Hromadas are in that in that square, well, rectangle, I'm sorry, these are rectangles. So basically you can see that, we have like if once we rule out everybody who is zero, so there were no protests here and they're kind of evenly spread out, there were some early adopters, but this is like yellow, meaning that there are more than 500 territorial community. They were super late adopters. They waited all the way to the deadline, right? And but after that, it kind of goes this way, like we have this like weird increase trend. And honestly, when you look deeper into the data, you will see that, these are days. I can imagine you're counting years right now, so I will help you. So on average, between the February of 2014, so the end of Euromaidan, and the adoption of the reform, on average, for those who didn't have a protest, it was 4.5 years. Okay, 4.5 years is about right. It's 2014 plus 4.5. That gives us around 2018, so around the middle of this whole, decentralization ordeal. However, those who had protests had a slightly longer period of adoption on average by half a year. So we are looking at half a year here, or take it or leave it. Well, slightly more. So when I looked into the actual coefficients, I will see that no matter how I measure the protest, we observe positive relationship between the number of days before the protest and adoption of the reform and the protest itself. So on average, you can see that going from no protest to protest increases the delay by 186 days. And when we look at protest intensity, yes, the substantive significance kind of drops, like 50 days versus 3 days. Maybe it's not that important, but like the idea is that it's moving in the same direction. If you have protests, you are adopting your reform later. That's just what it is. That's what this table shows. And then yes.
So I understand. So this is really interesting because you would think the opposite would be the case. I mean, that these are these aren't just, random protests, these are protests in favor of the kinds of policies that these reforms are trying to implement.
Yes,
So
exactly.
it's even more kind of puzzling than it seems, even, when you think about, a lot of times in these studies of protests, some are in favor, some are against, and then, you can understand why it would be harder to make an agreement. But here, you would think, oh, yes, they're doing protests, it should be easier to get this stuff. So it's really neat.
Yeah, so I belong to this like second group of literature that says that reform hinders, protest hinders reform. But I'm saying that it is not because they do not support the cause.
Yeah.
It's because we have way too many people in the room discussing the cause. We know that authoritarian regimes are very good at decision making, like that immediately. This is not the story. This is a lot of people have a lot of opinions, and you will see in a second how they express those.
Sorry to interrupt again, but I'm just curious, like, you list a lot of control factors, like the size of the armada and stuff like that. But I'm curious, like, did you take out like the population of like each individual city to like see the amount of delay that would happen? Because obviously if you have a city with a larger population, even if the percentage of urban population in that given commune is the same, like if you have a larger city, you're going to have more protest activity because there's more people. But that could also mean maybe more pushback, or maybe just more things that have to be taken care of because they're just so. I was wondering if you looked into like the size of cities that have protests and see how that goes.
So first of all, yes, cities have a substantial effect, whether it's the percentage of urban population, that's exactly what you're talking about. But the reason why I don't have like population as a control variable, for example, here, but only the percentage of urban population is because the last time Ukraine had census was 2001. Lots of things happened since 2001. I just don't want to, mess up the whole thing. That's why I'm substituting with the percentage of urban population just to tackle exactly what you're saying. And yes, it is. Look at this. It's a shame to have it on your table. So, I'm trying to figure out, maybe I should just drop observations that are like messing up my results essentially.
I mean, it's good that you're not like assuming like 2001 statistics are still true today.
Yeah, it's not.
Ukrainian, I'm not even there because I was born in 2002, so.
You're born after the statistics.
Yeah.
Well, we can go back to Gogol and, dead souls and assume that, some die, some born, on average, it's the same, but it's not really true. All right. So back to this whole story. So once I established that, okay, they delayed the reform, I am trying to understand whether this delay actually was this, what else happened. And here I have two measures to capture the efficiency of reform implementation. The first one is basically the amount of money received for projects funded by the State Regional Development Fund. So how it works? We have a Ministry of Regional Development in Ukraine, and those guys have grants. And local communities have to apply for those grants. Usually the authorities do that, so no resident participation there. The same way you apply for your research grants, it's very competitive. Those grants are minuscule because, and I will show you in a second, because the the territorial community has to fund the majority of the projects themselves. And it is highly competitive. Those guys, the central authorities do not have much money. So here we basically have communities competing for a very small portion of the central budget. The second measure is the number of e-democracy projects that communities decided to participate. And this is resident driven. As a resident in a territorial community, you can literally go online and submit a claim. And this will go into this measure. So whenever people decide to participate in any sort of e-democracy project, and I will show you what those are in a second, it just goes into this measure. And here is a couple of fun facts for you. So this is the number of those highly competitive executed funds from the Ministry of Regional Development. And please note, the majority of these projects are under 4,000 hryvnias. That is 100 bucks, okay? This is what they're competing for. And yet they are competing. It still matters for those territorial communities to win this. This is the level of activism you expect from authorities. And then, if you look at the website, you will see that there is no button like apply for this grant or like something like that, because they actually, territorial communities have to hire specialists to come to them to write this grant proposal and to submit it through internal sources that are not available to us to even see online. And many people see it as business opportunities, as you can imagine. And for example, this is a very typical NGO, which was, by the way, sponsored on Google when I searched for this stuff. Okay, they are promoting their thing, where you have immediately the button start project. And as a local mayor, you can go, you can hire them, and they will, submit the application for you. So it's a business model, okay, at this point. But it also means that local territorial communities have to be very active and very competitive. But then we have e-democracy projects. You don't need any specialists. I, from here, can go and submit some sort of claim. I will used to have a VPN, but like, who cares? So you will see that on average, the territorial communities don't really have them, but those who do, they have 1, 2, 3, or 4 projects per territorial community. So that's not that many of them, per year. And currently the number of increasing, but in my database runs to 2024, so it's a little bit limited. And for e-democracy projects, it's much easier. This is a website. You can go yourself. It's called edem.ua. And immediately it's like, influence your future. Here is like nice local petitions. There is a button here where I can log in and immediately submit this petition. So it's like very low cost, very easy. And this is basically, we have petitions, participatory budgets, consultations with the public. This is just their statistics module. Then school projects, because as you can imagine, when these participatory budgets were just introduced, parents gathered together and claimed everything that was in the participatory budgets for schools. Parents are very aggressive activist group in Ukraine, as everywhere. So after the first year, they were immediately like separated and like isolated from the rest of the population. And finally, we have open Harmada, which is basically like when you have a problem with the authorities, you will go there and like you submit a claim, whatever it is. And what I saw running this analysis was that the presence of protests increase your ability to get funds from this regional development fund by 69,000 hryvnias, and the average is 4,000. Imagine the difference. You immediately get so much more money from the central budget if you had a protest. And again, like this, for example, for duration, there is no statistical significance, and then for intensity, it's like 7,000 hryvnias, but that's still a lot of money, in comparison, especially to the average. And when we think about the e-democracy projects, yes, same pattern here. Having a protest increases, the probability that there will be e-democracy projects in a given community. So, what does it all mean? Like, just wrap up a little bit. Let's have a look at one case just to understand how this whole thing works. So this is a city of Khmelnytsky in Western Ukraine. And it's the population is 250,000. So think about Buffalo, New York, slightly smaller, but about this size. So, and the level of importance, let's say, in public affairs is about the same. So when the Euromaidan protest started there, you can see that it was very small. This is the beginning. it's November 2013. You know, it's literally 5 people taking pictures of one another, you know? It's a very, very small protest. But just in a couple of weeks, it was a substantive crowd with flags, with everything that you need. And therefore, you know, it was a very, you know, like tangible political event. People couldn't, like at this point, there were several hundred, people couldn't notice that. And all of these people, I'm arguing, they acquired this knowledge about how to protest during Euromaidan. Now, let's fast forward to today, 2025. What is happening there? Well, first and foremost, they managed to receive 439,000 hryvnias so far over the years from the State Regional Development Fund. They are working on competing for that money. So they are there for that money. This relatively small protest actually resulted in them being competitive on that market. In addition, the money contributed through participatory budgets are 5.5 million hryvnias, which is a lot by Ukrainian standards. And also, when we talk about public involvement into those projects, there are 13,000 residents who participated in voting for this participatory budget projects in 2025. So people are participating, and 13,000 is much more than you see on the previous slide, you know, participating. So this learning effect actually has a curve, and this curve is basically on the increase. Now, at the moment on this official website, they have like over 1,000 petitions, 16 supported projects, then, you know, problems with the government, 10 problems resolved, and they have some like 18 projects for like consultations with the public. So, you know, these numbers are very average at the moment for Ukrainian communities. However, when you click onto them and look into those petitions, you see, like, eventually, if you dive deep enough, you will see something about Ozzy Osbourne. You will see something about, you know, like renaming of streets. So, like, there is a huge variation of what people understand as this, like, political activism right now. And what is more is that when you look into like general consultations, it's like public hearings, you will see that the majority of them have something about like renaming streets, so decommunization in Ukraine is still happening, or you know, the majority of them, that's true. And then there is something about statues. So this is symbolic politics at this point. They don't have like actual like potholes or I don't know, like bus stops that need installing. They kind of tackled this in earlier rounds. In 2025, it's, you know, there is still activism and there are still projects, but these projects are about, you know, symbols. And then, and this is going to be like a little fun thing to end this talk, we can have a look at the budgetary participatory budgets funded. The majority of them, I'll be honest with you, were either, you know, occupied by parents who kind of funded projects for their kids, you know, outside of schools. They acquired knowledge how to penetrate the system regardless. So it's like mostly playgrounds, gyms, you know, things for kids. And if you look at the pictures, you know, you can tell that this is for kids. But another, you know, 40%, I would say, has to do with war problems. And those war problems in Western Ukraine is rehabilitation for veterans. So veterans, you know, integration into the society, veterans physical rehabilitation, things like this. So this is like a very large percentage of these projects. Now, this is one of the projects that got funded. And if you think that you're looking at a hot tub, you're right, it is a hot tub. So what got funded here is a hot tub for, well, a number of them, it's almost 200,000 hryvnias, for a physical rehabilitation center for Ukrainian veterans. So people get back from the war zone, many of them are heavily injured. They have a physical rehabilitation center with actual, you know, it's like a hospital facility. And these guys decided that they need hot tubs there and they got funded. So here are a couple of fun things that happen here. Before you can get this money through this local activists, you actually have to go to the public hearing and you have to present your case. You have actual slides and actual presentation, and anyone from your territorial community can show up, be there, listen to you, and vote. And I downloaded actual slides and I took some screenshots. So this is under the title of our partners, and these are basically two organizations. This is Legion of Unconquered, and this is a veteran organization, that takes care of these veterans. And you can see that it's a heavily military, picture. And this is the rehabilitation center, physical rehabilitation center, the Shore of Hope. This is medical stuff. So this is basically a hospital with veteran organization together. So that was quite nice. But then when it comes to their budget, because you have to have a budget slide and you have to say what will be the percentage that you are funding and what will be the percentage that the territorial community is funding. They were like, this is our budget and the territorial community is funding 100%. Done. And the reason why you see this is because, this, and I want to reiterate this, these are very young democratic institutions of participation. And therefore, the experience on how to do this slide, in addition to those pictures of hot tubs, which is precious, I think, they are very young, so people might not have enough experience. And yes, they did not get 250,000, they got 197. So their budget was cut, but they still got this money. It is still possible. So with this in mind, I want to conclude that I am arguing that protest does delay the adoption of the reform. And yet, protest activities actually make people more actively involved in what is going on in their armadas. And they participate more in e-democracy. They participate more in this competition for newly available public resources. And as a result, we basically get this active residents who are willing to benefit from the pro-democracy reform that protests essentially kind of delayed, but also brought to them. So with this in mind, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Well, unlike most chairs, I think I will be restrained and save my questions for later and just throw it open for anybody who has questions or feedback.
Thanks very much for a really interesting talk. I think I learned a lot. I wonder if you would benefit from some comparisons. And I'm thinking of my own Poland, where decentralization in the late 90s, early 2000s has led to a strong local government. And it has been hailed as one of the success stories, if not the success stories of Poland's transformation. But without necessarily being driven by protest, unless you think back to the 80s and solidarity glory days, I'm sure that probably some would be needed out of that. But it seems to me that in the Polish case, kind of more long-term structural factors like administrative design, institutional capacity, urban-rural divide, which I think you measure as well. And I think perhaps most interesting, history of partitions and kind of the three distinct occupational zones and the cultural factors that they have left behind. And there's probably something to unpack there as a comparison to Ukraine and your border proximity to Russia and Belarus. But yeah, perhaps there's something that goes beyond that. Has strong explanatory power for ultimately a considerable variation in outcomes in terms of how things work out, and this includes participatory budgeting as well, stability of regional governments and so forth. So I wonder if these factors don't put some shadow over the working of protests, protest histories and trajectories in your claim. So there's something tautological about what your argument is. If that doesn't, I don't mean it to sound this harsh, but there is something tautological in this. Protests make people participate. I wonder if you could unpack this a little bit based on that comparison.
Thank you very much. So yeah, I agree that legacy of past of past events and past institutional settings, they must have effect in in themselves on the outcome variables here. Now, the reason why you didn't see administrative design or institutional capacity as one of the control variables here is because reform was designed to change this. So everybody gets a new but identical across all units and administrative design institutional capacity. So to address your concern, I would have to like look deeper into history, right? And look at what it was before. But if we go just like, you know, I don't know, 30 years before, that's the Soviet Union, right? And the Soviet Union was great at making everything homogeneous and identical. So we basically moved from identically problematic institutional design of the USSR to identically problematic transitional problems. The thing that, I would argue did vary was like the willingness of local authorities to basically claim full authority to themselves versus to, engage in any sort of democratic exercise. But, I try to like observe this variation. And honestly, in my opinion, it's unobservable. So, if we want to have this sample of 1,400 communities, it's kind of difficult to go back in time and to question people like how authoritarian was your mayor back in early 2000s. And I haven't found like anything that would suggest. In my other papers, I look at their budgets before all of that was happening, but that's basically variation between rich and poor. And yes, there is a correlation. So the richer you are, the later you are about to adopt this reform. But that kind of makes sense. If you're rich, like everything is fine, why would you want to change anything? If you're poor, everything is bad, you want to change things as soon as possible. So again, this is tautological in itself as well, because, who is poor, who is rich, what are the outcomes? In terms of this urban-rural divide and like a history of partitions, for example, I totally agree with you that we have a large legacy. For example, for Ukraine, you can see like hundreds, if not thousands, of studies of how Holodomor or Stalin persecutions affected political behavior. And we know from the existing research that it actually makes people more opportunist. So they would vote for the strongest candidate, they would avoid protests, they would try to escape or to relocate to other, countries, for example. So we know a lot about political behavior, but it is individual political behavior. And here I'm talking about like group behavior, if you wish. But thank you very much for this feedback. I think that maybe I should include something like from deeper history.
Okay, congratulations.
Thank you.
Really great project. And I'm sorry I missed half of your presentation. So if you said any of this, just let me know. Well, first of all, a little general question. Can you apply for money for projects that benefit people outside your region? And nothing about kids from the war or from another region. Okay, just curious. The question is, did you look at the role of maybe civic entrepreneurs, kind of political or leaders who were engaged in civic behavior or leading NGOs before 2014, or maybe after Maidan? And maybe there's some kind of effect of these civic entrepreneurs in, spurring others to participate or making the first moves to teach people to kind of apply for that money.
Thank you very much for your question. So there are a lot of people who are interested in exact this same question. And the only way to go really deep in history is just to look at the registrations of local NGOs. Back in the day.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, many of those were, these bogus NGOs that just were registered for money laundering and everything. So it immediately becomes a question like, what are you measuring? Are you measuring like channels of corruption or channels of civic engagement? So that was like the general criticism. So the way people try to tackle it is to basically go to these territorial communities and ask them questions throughout a certain period of time, how engaged you are, do you have local, business representatives participating in decision making, or local residents, or local NGOs, who is doing what, basically, questions like this. And actually, Tim just mentioned, part of this project before he left. So he and some people at Kyiv School of Economics have been running this study, and I actually try to to integrate their older results. But what they observed there is the following: that after the full-scale invasion, because their interest is full-scale invasion, right? The resident involvement in everything you saw decreased, well, because people left and there is war, and local business involvement increased, because as a business you cannot just relocate your production facilities overnight just because somebody invaded your country. You will try to make it work regardless. So there is this kind of variation. And same with local NGOs, those that were oriented at, something that requires residents availability for them, they left together with residents. Those that actually care about like infrastructural development, educational outcomes, healthcare outcomes, so like localized problems, they stayed. So we have a lot of variation, especially given that, there is a war. But before 2014, Ukraine had a much more closed system of data reporting, and a lot of the things were actually destroyed. For some of my other projects where I'm dealing with corruption, I received letters when I requested data. I received letters saying that documents were destroyed. So just like that, they are not, the reason they are not politically relevant anymore. And we didn't want to save all these pieces of paper literally in our storages, so we destroyed them. But so I see a problem here rather than a solution. Sorry.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, for this, everybody else, I learned a considerable amount today, but my main question kind of deals with the e-democracy projects, especially the course and nature of them. You mentioned a concentration around school projects, but as well as some goofy ones like the Ozzy Osbourne one. Is there any research, within your research, is there any commonalities regionally in terms of kind of the concentrations of e-democracy projects or project grants? Is Western more excited about playgrounds or school projects, whereas kind of more closer to the East, more focused on Veterans Affairs, not to kind of put things in types too much, but when it comes to the course and nature, especially looking to the near-term future, what exactly do you notice? That makes any sense.
Thank you very much. So with veterans, it's kind of evenly spread, because once you finish serving in the Ukrainian military, you either go back home, or if your home doesn't exist anymore, you go somewhere else. And you can even go to Ukrainian village here, and you will see lots of these people there on the streets, because some of them end up here, right? So it's a very big variation. But when it comes to what gets funded through EDM, just to directly respond to your question, obviously those areas that were either occupied or are heavily shelled, they will have more rebuilding projects. So basically rebuild local school, rebuild local hospital, build a shelter, build this, build that, so, and in Khmelnytsky, there was no massive destruction reported, so we see none of that. But on the other hand, when it comes to Western regions that are not as destroyed, we actually see a pretty healthy variation. So we see this some things that are related to war, something that is related to educational outcomes. In the past, so I would argue before 2022, there were also lots of healthcare projects, because that was the period when also Ukraine was coming through a healthcare reform. It's kind of over by now, so we didn't see anything like that today. And there was the outlier here, big outlier, is Lviv as a city, because they have 90% of their project devoted to culture. like theater and music and, you know, just people essentially applying for like art grants. And I think that nobody cares. Like the local mayor actually likes it. So, you know, but they are an outlier and obviously they kind of do not matter in the big scheme.
So I also really liked your presentation. This is a very specific question, but my throat. But is there something special about the city of Khmelnytsky that like something demographically different? Like, are there more young people? Is there like more TV coverage of it or something that like led to like like a huge protest kind of erupting in that one area, like
No.
demographically?
This case study was specifically selected because it is so average. Like there is literally, like I said, buffalo. Think about buffalo. Do you get excited when you hear buffalo?
You said it was around 200,000 people, but I'm curious because you said that this one specific city turned into a huge protest despite having that smaller population. And so I was curious if there was anything demographically different about it, like.
Oh, that was quite typical. So basically what was happening was that, and we can think about Kiev as a very large city and, you know, I don't know, Yaremche as a small village. The protest would start with a couple of people literally. In Kiev, it was like 30 people at first and then 100, right? And there it would be like 1, 2, 5 maybe that would come and, you know, these were just young people protesting. But then when police attacked the protesters in Kiev, there was so much resentment that, you know, essentially parents of these students who were there showed up and then relatives and then everybody else. And it grew into a sizable protest. And so I did not, please note that in my analysis, I did not use the size of the protest, like number of people on the streets as a variable. It was just either protest or no protest. And the reason for that is because we don't like very often it was very difficult to measure how many people there were. Imagine that like my information comes from pro-Western mass media outlet. There would be more than it was real, or pro-Russian, and then like they would report that there was no protest whatsoever. So, you know, I don't want to look into those you know, speculations. But also, you know, what is, in my opinion, much more important is whether the protest is long enough for us to even notice it, because like you would notice it as a local resident, not because there are like millions of people on the streets of a city of 200,000, you know, that would be odd and that is probably not what's going to happen, but because you kind of walk to your work in the morning and you see these flags in the central square, let's say, and you're like, oh, there is a protest happening not only somewhere far, far away, you know, 5 hours by train, but it is also happening here. So maybe I should join, or maybe I don't want to join because I don't support them. And, you know, it's not in the model here, obviously, but my grand idea is that this is a learning curve. Like, think about Columbia community. Even people who never protested in their lives, once they were exposed to protest, they started thinking about the protest, right? Even if they didn't do anything, they were just like thinking and having opinions. And maybe they acted on those opinions eventually, did something. So here is the same idea. Even if you live in a location where there was protest, but you never participated, you had a chance to think about it. If you live in a location where protest never happened, you never even considered a necessity to think about it, or to believe that you can be important politically to your community by, you know, participating in EDAM projects, or I don't know, actually like forcing your local government to compete for resources.
So could you remind me what the Khmelnytsky protest was about?
It was about the failure of signing of the association agreement with the EU. That's why they had those European flags. Just a second here. I'm not sure you can like vividly see them, but you see some like EU stars here and there, and same over here, like the stars. So it's basically like we want to join the EU. signed the agreement, because the idea that Yanukovych and company can be removed from their positions, it came a little bit later. At first, it was just like you cannot stall the pro-EU processes, and then it developed into what you saw.
So do you have like a data on like the topic of the protest? You know, for different places in different years, is this like
Yeah,
the typical topic of the protests? Or is it more typical that the protests were on some local grievance?
So I only look at the protests that happened between November 21st, 2013 and February 22nd, 2014. So 3 months of protests. And the whole country was participating in the same protest, which was called Euromaidan. And this protest had like the agenda, centrally decided agenda. And that whole agenda was at first only about the EU, and like we want democracy, basically broadly defined. And then eventually when they started attacking the protesters, it became anti-governmental in its nature, because government was suppressing the protest. So basically we have like 2 topics essentially, and they are very interconnected with one another.
So my question then is, how the protests, which were about this fundamental issue of the direction of the country, the nature of its political system and its economics, relate to the political activism that comes later around essentially pork barrel politics, getting a hot tub or getting something for some symbolic purpose to be appreciative of the soldiers or something like that. These small amounts of money going to pork barrel local projects almost sound like a distraction of civic activism from major issues of, what are the policies of, our country as a whole? What are the main like functional policies of local governance? And that people are like distracted into forming civic groups for these, sounded like pretty trivial activities. I know your main book project is about corruption and clientelism. And so I'm wondering if this kind of, fight over pork barrel politics at a trivial level is a way of creating a semblance of freedom for democratic participatory action, as opposed to steering people towards that and away from the Maidan type big issues.
So this is an excellent question. Thank you so much. So the idea here that what you're suggesting that, it's just like they're distracting attention would be true if it would come from actors who have incentives to do so. So top-down process, like, here is what you can do. Why don't you do this? That kind of idea. Whereas here, the direction of the incentive is the opposite. It is grassroots. And this is basically the idea that connects this to visibly unrelated phenomena, because like if we just take 2 maps, decentralization and protest, they don't really overlap, like one-to-one visually, at least, right? So the idea here is that when you participate in a protest that is like generally pro-democratic, yes, you think about like democracy and EU and all those big issues, but one of the things that you see is think about is your political behavior. Are you important or are you unimportant as a political actor, individual citizen, let's say? And, we know, for example, the case of Russia, where the protest is repressed. So everyone who think that they are important actually leave the country eventually. And everybody who think that they are small people and cannot change anything stays in the country and doesn't participate in protest or any political activities. Here we see the opposite trend, essentially. All the success of this protest and the ability to participate, without fear for your life, for example, at first, it changed later on, but at first, actually makes you think that you are important as a political actor, as an individual who has a job and maybe kids and lots of problems, in your life, but you are important. So with this in mind, when reforms start being implemented and they are supported by the European Union that you supported as a protester, all of a sudden you kind of start participating in the democratic processes, and then we come to this pork barrel essentially redistribution, if you wish, is that if I am important as a political entity, I participate in elections, I participate in protests, and I participate in all of this like opportunities, which are petitions, public hearings, budgets, things like this. What are real things that I can change? If people want to petition, about, I don't know, like corrupt politicians, they can. But most likely you're not like investigating local politicians on a daily basis. Instead, you walk on the street, you see that the street still has communist name, you want to change that. Or you walk on the street, you see people heavily injured through their military service, you want to help these people. Or you might be very, very selfish and you're like, okay, what can I do for my family, And my family, for example, needs a gym, so that's what we're gonna fund. So yes, it becomes a very low level of salience, if you wish, at the national level, but that is the whole idea of decentralization. You want to, you start caring, but also affecting only very low level, problems locally. But that's because you know that you can do this as a individual political entity. And then we observe what the paper is about, and that is group behavior, essentially. You show up, and yes, as it was clearly suggested, it is kind of tautological that in locations where we saw activism, we will see more activism, right? But then it has very tangible political and economic outcomes. In the locations where we saw activism, we will see money brought by this activism, and that's what I'm measuring.
And so one last question about the ultimate source of the funding and the ultimate source of the decision to of this type of way of dispensing the money. Was some of the funding for this from the EU as part of the candidacy process? Or was it from national money appropriated in the Rada from just general Ukrainian national treasury, or where did the money come from?
That's an excellent question. So all the monies that you saw in this paper is the budget. It's either the local budget that stays locally, or the central budget where local communities are still paying certain percentage, 40% of income tax to be more specific. There is no EU money, and there is no, like some sort of like, I don't know, IMF transfers or any of that sort. And this is also an important component here of this activism, because I know this is my money that I paid through taxes. So what I'm currently getting back from the system is my money, my taxes back. The taxes will be spent not on some sort of like weird administrative management stuff that I don't even understand, but it will be spent on a hot tub, if you wish.
But no, this is my last thing. So normally you would think that the thing that would matter most to people in like getting good value from their tax money would be like the fundamental workings of health, education, and welfare in the society, plus keeping the roads and bridges repaired, and that they would not be mainly focused on hot tubs. And
So that's
so
already in the.
how is it that people are like happy to spend their money on hot tubs rather than like crucial issues of health, education, and welfare?
That's already in the budget, healthcare, education, roads, I don't know, all rebuilding, over after the war destruction, it's already in the local budget, voted by the local council, it's already there. Participatory budgets is this teeny tiny superstructure where essentially the local government goes to local residents and asks, what else do you want in addition to all the things that we are providing for you? And what else can be, this like little sports facility or little, these are like very small ones. In the community where I lived in Kyiv, they really wanted red tiles for sidewalks. So that's what it ended up being. There were sidewalks because it was in the budget. There were already sidewalks, but they wanted them red. So that was that is like, it's like a superstructure. Yes, people care about the budget itself. It's just not, not here.
Oh, okay, back to the rest of the thoughts.
This is overlapping a little bit with what Jack was saying, I think. Did you look at the educational educational background of people who apply for the grants? Just because I wonder, if there has to be something else to get that sense of efficacy going, and they're sort of like, I can make a change. And it's connected to educational backgrounds. And what's kind of motivating my question is, I wonder if you had done this study in 2019, right before Zelensky was elected, if you would see a different outcome. Because of the disappointment with Poroshenko and the higher perception of the level of corruption that existed in the country. And why I'm saying that is because, like, on the one hand, we always think Maidan, it's great, all these things, efficacy, it leads to all these great outcomes. But there were also people who went to Maidan and felt massively disappointed, a few years later, because of the increasing corruption and hatred of the federal government. And I'm thinking of this mother-daughter couple in particular, which is what it's just popped into my head, that they were just sort of like, they came from the West, they went to Kyiv, they went back, and a year or two later, they were sort of like, we had our hopes raised, all of these things, and there's still so much corruption in our country, is just a disaster. And that's maybe why Zelensky got elected, but that's like the pattern of Ukraine, like get your hopes up, you really have a sense of efficacy, and then you're massively disappointed, and then throw the bum out and get some new leader in. So I guess it makes me just wonder about this conceptualization of Maidan as a positive, as always increasing a sense of efficacy, rather than a sense of maybe like disappointment in we are, oh wait, we're not European and non-corrupt and all these things, we actually have problems. So that's why I asked if you'd done this study earlier, if you might see a different outcome, or why I asked if maybe it's about who participated in Maidan and whether they were educated or whether they already had a sense of efficacy and that just like persists. Whereas people who are kind of like more outsiders to politics and were attracted by those big issues and went all in on it and then said, well, nothing really changes, there's still corruption. Then they may come back and actually do the opposite, which is like check out. And I guess it doesn't matter to do a counterfactual of you did study earlier, but maybe arguably the same pattern could happen again, despite the success of reforms, right? For some regions, there's like a lot of disappointment in Zelensky and disappointment in the board and, all of the problems. So I don't know, is that?
Yeah, it makes total sense. So I will first answer the first question about education. So those who apply to those for those grants, these are not individuals, these are local administrations. So it's administration as a whole applying, and probably there is average level of education, but it's average per community. With regards to this, like, are people disappointed in Poroshenko? So before any of this public allocation of funds could happen, the reform had to be over. So the database actually for funds starts in 2021. Before that, because the reforms ended in 2020, in October of 2020 to be more precise. So I cannot do before Zelensky, but I can do before and after full-scale invasion. And in fact, again, I did not I was not trying to add war here as a separate variable, but if I were to add it, yes, a lot of things changed because right after 2020, we have this rapid decrease in the amount of funding allocated. And then, it kind of evened out approximately 2023. And the reason was that people just left. They couldn't care less about, about what was happening. So it took a while for communities to actually learn to work under the new conditions of war. And right now, everything that I'm talking about, you can see was Humanistic 2025, Ozzy Osbourne is the topic to discuss, these are, despite the war, these are functioning communities. But in 2022 and 2023, it was a very different story.
So you're doing quite a good job with these challenging questions. I was just curious. You mentioned earlier about how Ukraine has to reform its economy, its tax policies, all that in order to potentially join the EU. Now, would you say that there's any pushback against that in Ukraine? And I don't just mean pro-Russian per se, but people who are not pro-Russian, but they also don't necessarily want to accept all the terms that come with being part of the European Union. Have you seen any pushback or?
Of course, you can imagine people being very unhappy about those bottle caps, Why don't they come off like normal bottle caps? Yes, all of these little changes, they do have local resistance, just you can think about Poland. People were very unhappy about tax rates right after the EU accession, that was a very rapid increase. And same with everything in Ukraine, same with everything else. I would say that even so, in Ukraine, people are less likely to be unhappy with policy changes associated with the EU because of all the war effort and the EU helping Ukraine a lot. And, so there is public sentiment that is specifically pro-EU, but yeah, there are people who are very unhappy about little changes.
Thank you so much. And I think you tackled a very complicated topic in a very engaging way. And I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I wanted to ask, what do you think is different in terms of Maidan was a success. And it has led to this incredible transformation of Ukraine, right? And if you compare it to former post-Soviet states, and there's been protests in Armenia, Georgia, and Moldova, probably, right, in Russia. None of them succeeded to this sort of a result. What was different?
I would disagree that none of them succeeded. We don't know how long this happy story will be going on. It might be over tomorrow for very obvious defense reasons, right? So in Georgia, for example, if you think about, their revolution and subsequent decentralization reform, it was really nice, especially police reform, if you think about it. Ukraine never achieved this level of success in terms of, very, very tangible institutional reforms. It just, yes, right now there is a, trend in the opposite direction, I would call it this way. But again, we don't know whether that's the future for Ukraine. With Armenia, Azerbaijan, I don't know, Moldova and other similar countries, yes, I would say that, they They have their own challenges, but generally speaking, if we were to run a very similar analysis, protest versus reform, define which one you like, for many of these EU aspiring states, we would see something, I believe we would see something very similar, because that's a general trend. And, that is by design, actually, because the European Commission has this whole Eastern Neighborhood program, and they are pouring millions of euros to make it all work, and they, kind of hope that it will work the way they want. So I think that we will see a very similar trend.
So if somebody wanted to do further research along the lines inspired by what you've done so far, would it be fair to say that the next test, somebody who's just beginning their dissertation that needs a good topic, would the next test of your hypothesis be to see whether there's spillover from this kind of local activist organizing into political organization that's either building local political party structures in these localities, or is tackling like the fundamental list of transformative issues in government structure and policy, kind of building on the civic activist networks that got their start lobbying for the hot tubs and the statues. Would that be a fair test of the next step?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I would argue that we are not at the political party development stage yet. We're not there yet. So I don't think that it would be like a big data set that you would be able to collect. But something that is already happening, and this is one of the projects that I'm working on with my co-authors, is that all this, local activism events that we observe today, yes, there are NGOs and like civic organizations that are kind of trying to join the trend and to be there. And so, but they do not have access to those public resources. Instead, they have to be very creative where they take their money from. And what they did in the past, many of them were funded by the USAID. We all know what happened to that. So the paper I'm working on, basically, we reached out to like thousands of them, got responses to like a couple of hundred of them. And what we are trying to understand what they did after the collapse of the USAID system, because they basically lost funding. They still do not have access to this funding that I'm talked about today. Well, as individual residents, but not as NGOs. So they had to reinvent themselves as the EU funded structures. And basically it's like exact same model. How do these organizations and the past that they have in these local communities, protest past or like general like political past, impacts their ability to compete for very limited funding opportunities that currently mostly come from the EU, and there are a couple of projects funded by Japan, but that's not enough for us to have some some larger observations. So yeah, that's basically the treatment there is the absence of the USAID, essentially.
So back in 2015, several of us faculty from the Harriman took a short visit where we went to some different places around Ukraine, Lviv, Dnipro, and Kiev, and we talked to the progressive mayors and the progressive NGO people that were like eager to reform in a pro-EU direction, and well, why aren't you doing more? And they said, well, the Rada hasn't approved decentralization yet. Oh, well, okay. But they said the other thing is that we need money for TV access or to do projects, and we don't have money unless we get it from the oligarch that supports us. Because they own the TV station and they have the cash to fund projects. So we have to, work within the channels that are okay with the oligarchs. Just like Zelensky himself got support from Kolomoisky, whose office we visited, stacked up with the art auction books for their money laundering enterprise. So, is there, so two-part question. One is that phenomenon still a restraint on civic action that's more politically meaningful than the hot tubs? And if the answer is sort of like, which direction does that seem to be heading? Is this like yesterday's problem from 2015, or is it a future problem as well?
So we're running low on time, so I will not show you on the big screen, but yes, this is yesterday's problem, and it was solved by Radas adopting this decentralization reform. So if you go to the official website of a decentralization program in Ukraine and click on international relations or partnerships, something like that, they don't have to go to oligarchs anymore. Instead, they go to foreign actors who fund them. And it just happens so that the legislation was adopted that allows them to partner with local communities abroad. So, for example, the city of Copenhagen can fund the city of Khmelnytsky through this one-to-one partnership. And right now, all the money that they would go and ask from an oligarch, they go and ask from the city of Copenhagen. And there is like really fun map on that website where it's like Ukraine and like arrows going in all directions like that, and it's just like very messy, so you have to zoom in. But the idea is that the majority of this territorial communities that I talked today, so it's like 80%, I believe, have already established one-to-one partnerships with other foreign entities. And basically these entities are channeling money on a regular schedule. And everybody, we can put it into our budget because we know how much is coming. And essentially when NGOs, so activists need this kind of money, they would not go after our taxes. They would go after, well, Danish taxes or, something like that. And that's how they solve this problem. This is why oligarch participation right now is a very unique occasion. And usually it gets reported in mass media. For example, oligarchs, Surkis brothers were built a daycare facility in Kiev region. It was all over mass media. People were going nuts. And they just changed windows after Russian artillery shell. It's not that much money for them, but it's like big news these days.
Well, thank you so much. We learned so much today from your presentation and from your great Q&A. So we appreciate that, and also appreciate the audience for really helping us out today. So yeah.